The story begins with a church ceremony in which a priest touches a crystal ball and informs someone that their suitable profession is that of a soldier. The church officials kept calling teenagers forward one by one. Among them was Chris Sparring, standing in line. Everyone whispered about him. He was the son of the famous Sparring family. They wondered what profession he would receive. Hearing their high expectations, Chris grew anxious. He and the other teens were taking part in the ritual of heavenly grace. In the kingdom of Meldrake, all 16-year-olds went through this ritual to discover their suitable profession and the skills that came with it. The professions ranged from combat roles to non-combat jobs, with some rare and advanced ones appearing from time to time. Those who received a high-class profession were given special treatment, while those with lower-ranked jobs faced disappointment. Chris's father had always expected great things from him. For years, he had trained Chris, hoping he would receive a profession that would surpass his own. Chris could only hope that he wouldn't be humiliated in the ritual. The priest called Chris forward. He knelt and waited for the priest's announcement. The priest then declared that Chris was suited to be a farmer and had the skill poison resistance. Hearing this, Chris felt like his world had collapsed. People around him began whispering. Suddenly, a boy spoke loudly, questioning if Chris would really be a farmer. He patted Chris on the back and told him it was okay. The boy was Klaus, Chris's brother. Klaus then stepped forward when called. The crowd murmured about how kind he was for supporting his older brother. Despite Chris receiving the farmer profession, Chris looked down at his rough, trembling hands. He couldn't believe he had spent so many days working hard, only to fall short of his father's expectations. Everyone suddenly started talking about the person who had stepped forward and claimed the holy sword. The others found it intimidating. That person was Klaus, the fifth one to receive the holy sword since the first hero. The crowd cheered for Klaus, who stood in the spotlight, while Chris sat in silence, feeling down about his profession. Their father praised Klaus endlessly. As someone from the Sparring family, he told Klaus to become a great leader in the future. Meanwhile, Chris had been ignored the entire time. When he finally called out to his father, he was met with a look of pure disgust. Shocked, Chris didn't know what to say. His father then started complaining about how he had trained Chris for years, only for him to end up with a farmer profession. He was furious that Chris dared to stand before him without showing any emotion. Chris apologized, but his father only grew harsher. He ordered Chris to leave the house, calling him useless. Afterward, Chris decided to take only one bag with the things he needed. The day before, he had been nothing more than a practice dummy, sparring with Klaus using only his bare hands. As he was leaving, Klaus noticed him walking out and asked why he was leaving without saying anything. Then, Klaus told him not to worry, saying he had protected the family's reputation for him. His expression looked cruel, completely different from the kind face he showed in public. Chris couldn't even respond. Klaus complained that he didn't even hear a thank you from his own brother. Chris then asked why he was making fun of him when they had never really spoken before. Since childhood, Klaus had been weak, always staying close to their mother and the family doctor. He slowly got better at the age of 5 and started living a normal life, unlike Chris, who had been training hard since he was little. Chris also knew Klaus didn't like him because he never answered whenever he spoke to him. Until now, they had never really had a proper conversation. Klaus suddenly laughed and asked if Chris really didn't understand. He said that he had been the one abandoned by their father all this time. He couldn't believe that someone born just 10 minutes before him was raised with love and care while he was not. Chris understood how Klaus felt, but he still wondered why his brother hated him so much. If anything, he was the one who had wanted things to change the most. While he spent his childhood covered in bruises from endless training, he could only watch with jealousy as their mother showed kindness only to Klaus. Klaus kept laughing, saying that God was on his side this time and had given him the holy sword. He couldn't believe his brother had become just a farmer. Annoyed, Chris told him to be quiet. At that moment, Klaus pointed his sword at Chris's face, warning him not to get angry or he might kill him. Chris quickly blocked the sword and got into a fighting stance. Klaus laughed again, amused that a simple farmer thought he could fight someone holding a holy sword. Calmly, he told Chris that he was ready. In a split second, Chris's sword was already just a centimeter from Klaus's neck. Klaus was too shocked to say anything. Without a word, Chris sheathed his sword back and walked off. In his mind, he knew the result would be the same even as a farmer because he had trained hard since childhood, unlike Klaus. Angry, Klaus shouted that the fight wasn't over yet, but Chris said it was already finished. He had no interest in weak opponents. His words enraged Klaus, who then decided to kill him. Chris suddenly felt an intense pressure and turned around. He saw Klaus glowing with divine power. Klaus declared that Chris would die and unleashed his holy sword skill, Sacred Slash. The hallway exploded. When the smoke cleared, Chris was sitting on the floor in sweat, but completely unharmed. Klaus couldn't believe he had missed. He realized he had used too much power. Chris was at a loss for words. In his mind, the sword skills he had worked so hard to master seemed useless. Against the strongest profession, the gap in power was undeniable. Later, someone stormed through the forest entrance, shouting in frustration. Klaus couldn't believe he had been fooled again. Angry, he yelled for Chris to come back and fight him. Meanwhile, deep in the dark and quiet forest, Chris stumbled forward, struggling to catch his breath. He kept moving past the trees until he reached a lake. Exhausted, he collapsed against a tree and took off his boot, revealing a large bruise on his right foot. He had barely escaped danger and now had to figure out what to do next. As he rested, he thought about Klaus's smug expression. He still couldn't believe his own twin had tried to kill him. If Klaus found him again, he knew he wouldn't survive. Fearing someone might be chasing him, Chris decided to stay hidden in the forest for now. He only had a little bit of jerky left. If he wasn't injured, he could have hunted for food, but in his condition, that wasn't possible. He unwrapped some bandages from his arm and used them on his injured foot instead. Despite the pain, Chris forced himself to keep walking. He looked around, his face filled with worry. This was Pasha Forest, the place where he used to train with his father. But he had never gone this deep before. Strangely, there were no signs of animals or monsters anywhere. Chris found a small opening at the base of a random cliff. It wasn't much, but it gave him a place to stay, safe from the wind and rain. For now, all he could do was wait. Just then, his stomach growled loudly. At the same moment, a bug crawled in front of him. He stared at it, knowing he might have to eat it as a last resort. Realizing he needed food, Chris left the cave. Outside, he only saw plants with buds that looked like faces. Since he had toxic resistance, he believed he wouldn't die no matter what he ate. He hadn't tested this ability yet, but he hoped it would work. He took a bite of the nearest plant. The leaves were surprisingly sweet, but the flower was so bitter and disgusting that his whole body trembled. Moving on, he found another plant with bell-shaped flowers. After tasting it, he realized it was nothing but bitter and dry. If he kept eating plants like these, he figured something strange might happen to him. Chris started looking around for food. He found some strange-looking mushrooms and fruits, along with a flycatcher. He ignored the flycatcher and gathered anything that seemed edible. But he had another problem, finding clean water to drink. The only water nearby was a muddy puddle. When he scooped some up, it slipped through his fingers in a disgusting way. He thought about returning to the lake he had seen earlier, but it was too far. And he had wandered so deep into the forest that he no longer knew the way back. Chris had toxic resistance, so he reached for the muddy water, believing it wouldn't harm him. He hesitated, worried about dehydration. After a moment of doubt, he brought the water to his mouth. It smelled awful and tasted bitter, an unfamiliar and unpleasant sensation. Almost immediately, he threw up everything he had swallowed. In the end, there was no clean water and no real food. That night, as Chris lay inside the cave, he remembered his last fight with Klaus. He pictured Klaus smirking before cutting him in half with the holy sword. Imagining such event kept Chris awake, so he got up. Chris spent his days in the forest trying to survive. He made a stone axe, stayed inside the cave when it rained, and picked up bugs whenever he found them. After a few days, he finally got some meat. It was just a dead animal he found in the forest, but it was the first one he had come across. The meat was a little rotten, but after eating only plants and bugs for days, it felt like a feast. The smell was awful, but he hoped it would taste better after grilling it with some vegetables. Chris cooked the rotten meat with rosemary, then bravely took a bite. It was the worst meat he had ever eaten, but in his situation, it was the best meal he had in a long time. For the first time in days, his stomach felt full. The forest itself was not dangerous, but finding food was hard since no living creatures were nearby. He didn't know if it was because of the herbs, but the wound on Chris's foot had almost completely healed. Another day passed for Chris. He listened for animals or monsters, but only heard birds chirping. However, today felt different. He heard rustling nearby. Turning toward the sound, he found traces on the grass and a few footprints. A faint scent of beasts lingered in the air. Sensing something close, he quickly hid behind a tree. In the distance, he spotted a two-legged creature. Looking closer, he realized it was an orc. The massive monster stood tall, gripping a wooden club. Chris quietly watched the orc walk away, thinking it was on patrol. He remembered seeing orcs before. Even his proud father found them difficult to deal with unless he used his skills. If this orc was the same as the one his father had faced, it should be just as strong as Chris. Without skills, his father's strength wasn't much better than his own. Right now, Chris only had a makeshift stone axe, and using it to fight could be risky. Still, he was hungry for meat and decided to chase after the orc. He jumped over its head, trying to strike it. To his surprise, the orc noticed him and dodged. Chris missed his chance and broke into a cold sweat. The orc stared at him, locking eyes, and Chris quickly prepared himself for a fight. The orc swung its wooden club at him, but it only hit the ground. The orc began searching for Chris, who was hiding behind a tree. Chris felt relieved that the orc didn't run away. The orc soon found Chris and smashed the tree where he was hiding. Chris jumped around like an annoying rat, darting from tree to tree. The orc tried to find him, but Chris kept moving quickly like a ninja. The orc struck another tree, but its club got stuck in the trunk. Chris saw this as his chance. He quickly ran to the other side of the tree and hit the orc's back with his stone axe. But the weapon broke easily and snapped. In a panic, Chris quickly stepped back to get some distance. Luckily, the orc was knocked out and hit the ground with a loud thud. Seeing the orc fall flat on its face, Chris wondered if he had defeated it with just one hit. The orc was still alive though and started mumbling something. Chris realized that the wound he made was deep enough to keep the orc from moving. With no plan in mind, he used the broken handle of his axe to stab the orc in the head, ending its life. Chris looked at the blood pooling around the body. He was thankful for his toxic resistance because it allowed him to eat even rotten meat. Still, since he had taken the orc's life, he promised to make something good out of it. Chris then stabbed the orc again to make it bleed more. If there had been a source of water, he could have done a better job, but he had no choice. He knew it would be a hassle to disassemble the body now, so he decided to bring the whole thing back to his base. He carried the large dead orc in his bag, but it wasn't as heavy as he expected. As night settled over the forest, Chris finished cutting up the orc. It was large, so it took him a long time to break it into pieces. But in the end, he had a lot of meat to show for his hard work. It was a tiring day, but it felt worth it. He set aside what he needed for the day and went to tie up the rest to dry. He wanted to eat fresh meat right away, but he was covered in orc blood. He didn't want to make the muddy puddle any worse, but he had no choice. As Chris cooked the meat, he remembered that orcs were humanoid monsters and it was considered taboo to eat their meat. But in this situation, he didn't care. The smell was strong, but it wasn't like the usual rotten meat. This was the scent of fresh meat. Chris was only concerned about the taste, but he bravely took a bite. As he chewed, he realized how delicious it was. The meat was juicy and the flavor filled his mouth, reaching all the way to his brain. It was incredibly tasty and could easily be called an excellent dish. After the meal, Chris felt full and realized he had eaten the meat he had saved for the next day. He had planned to try different ways of cooking it, but now he didn't care. As he lay down, he remembered the fight with the orc, where it had dodged his surprise attack. He also noticed how thick the orc's hair and skin were. He knew this all too well since he had taken one apart himself. Inside the orc's thick body, there was a muscle that acted like armor. Until now, he couldn't hurt an orc badly with just one strike. But with a simple wooden stick, he had crushed its head and even carried the body back home without much trouble. He wondered if his strength came from the ritual's blessing. Even though his profession was farmer, the ability boost made him stronger. Still, it felt like he had become too strong. He wondered if it was because he had been defeated by Klaus that he grew stronger. The same idea applied to muscles. When they break, the body repairs them and makes them stronger. Maybe that's what had happened to him. But if that was the reason, it felt strange that he was getting stronger so suddenly. Regardless of the cause, it was a good thing, because he had been able to defeat the orc by himself. Chris's life in the forest continued. He made a bed to sleep on, trained his sword skills every day, and cooked the orc meat in different ways. He also spent time searching for food and watching the sunset. All of this happened in his small cave surrounded by nature. One day, Chris marked the walls of his cave and realized he had been in the forest for a month. He had also finished all the orc meat. In the past, Chris would have thrown away any leftover meat, but now he understood how hard it was to have no food. Even though the orc was a monster, he had killed it for its meat and he couldn't waste it. He buried the orc's bones and said a prayer of thanks. Though Chris could survive in the forest for a few more months, eating the last of the orc meat made him realize it would be harder to keep going with only the poor plants around him. He thought everyone outside had probably calmed down by now, so he saw this as his chance to leave the forest and find a city. His goal was simple, to survive and get stronger. He promised himself he would surprise both his proud father and his cruel twin brother. A little later, Chris returned to a familiar stream and drank clean water for the first time in months. He was happy to find his way back to the lake. Before this, he had only been drinking rainwater or muddy water. When he finally drank the clean water, it brought tears to his eyes. After his bath, Chris realized he couldn't leave the forest in his torn noble clothes. For now, he decided to tie his leather bag, made from the orc's skin, around his waist. It was better than being seen as an exhibitionist. Chris traveled through the forest for days until he finally reached a city. He arrived in Realzad, a busy and prosperous city near the royal capital, Meldrake. It was far from his hometown, which made it a good place to hide. He also knew that Klaus, who had received the Holy Sword, was probably being summoned to the royal capital. Realzad was closer to the capital, so Chris could keep an eye on Klaus while staying safe. He decided to use the city as his base. However, Chris could feel everyone's eyes on him. His clothes stood out, just as he expected. He was thankful that the city's entrance inspection was routine. It would have been a disaster if the guards had searched him thoroughly. He was allowed in since he didn't have any weapons. After getting a few coins, Chris realized he needed to spend them on clothes, food, and a place to stay. Looking at his finances, he knew he needed to find a way to make more money. Chris went to a prop shop called Goldborn. A man greeted him and led him to the appraiser's room. Chris knew it was a big company, so he thought he wouldn't get scammed. He had brought some items from his house that he wanted to sell before leaving. The appraiser greeted Chris but then looked him over from head to toe. The appraiser seemed disgusted and asked Chris to leave. Chris heard the appraiser then scolding an employee for letting someone in who clearly didn't have anything valuable. At first, Chris thought he had picked the wrong shop, but then he realized it made sense that it would be hard to trust someone wearing ragged clothes. What Chris didn't know was that someone shady was watching him from the shadows. Soon, Chris found himself walking through the slums, surprised that he was still in the same city. The shops in the city clearly showed what they sold, but the tents in the slums didn't give any clues at all. He felt it would be rude to peek inside the tents and complained that the people in the slums didn't even put up signs. The hooded kid who had been following Chris earlier suddenly tugged on his clothes. Chris asked if the kid had gotten lost. Without answering, the kid threw something at Chris. A strange liquid came out and covered his eyes, catching him completely off guard. Chris asked what the kid was doing, but the kid ran away without saying anything. In that moment, the kid also grabbed Chris's bag. Chris panicked. His stuff was stolen. He quickly opened his water bottle and splashed his face to wash off the strange liquid. Then he ran through the busy street and spotted the kid in the crowd. To his surprise, the kid easily moved through the sea of people without bumping into anyone. Chris noticed how good the kid was at running through crowds and guessed she was used to it. But that didn't matter when it came to someone like Chris. He quickly caught up to the kid and picked her up like a stray cat. He warned her not to take advantage of people's kindness. The kid was surprised and started to throw a tantrum, demanding Chris let her go. Chris warned her to stop shouting or he would punch her. Chris removed the hood from the girl and realized she wasn't a child, but someone around his own age. When he saw her crying and kneeling, it looked like he was the one who had done something wrong to her. He asked why she had stolen his things. The girl didn't answer and covered her mouth with her hands. Chris asked why she was covering her mouth. She said she would get beaten if she told him the reason. Chris said he would still beat her up no matter what. She then claimed there was no real reason for stealing, but if she had to come up with one, it was just to survive. She said that was why she became a thief. Chris wondered why she didn't target wealthier people instead of him. He started to think she might be lying. From her skills, Chris guessed that this wasn't the first time she had stolen, but the girl didn't comment on it. He asked if she had parents, but the girl said she had only weapons. Chris then asked if she had any accomplices. The girl panicked and hesitated at first. After thinking for a moment, she said she didn't have any accomplices, trembling. To Chris, she seemed like a terrible liar. Chris decided to take the girl to the soldiers, but she begged him not to. He told her to stop lying and just tell the truth. He mentioned that he wasn't going to report her to the authorities because he didn't want to deal with them. The girl then explained that her partners were the people living in an abandoned building. When Chris asked how many there were, she said just 2. He also asked if the other person was a thief too, and the girl confirmed it. Based on her reaction, Chris believed she was telling the truth this time. He held her head and asked where her accomplice was. He promised that she would be safe if she helped him find them. Meanwhile, a boy sat in the corner of a rundown house wondering what happened to his partner. She was late, and he feared she had been caught. His worry was correct. The girl had indeed been caught and was now in the house. The boy cursed and grabbed his sword. When Chris saw the boy preparing his weapon, he said he wouldn't hold back if the boy attacked. The girl told the boy, named Ralph, to drop his weapon. Ralph was confused. Since the girl had already been caught, he asked why she brought her captor with her. The girl explained that she would have been hurt if she didn't bring Chris along. Chris took a quick look at Ralph and realized that the boy knew some martial arts and sword techniques. However, his balance was poor, and Chris knew that even if Ralph tried, he wouldn't be able to defeat him. Ralph asked what Chris wanted, and said they had no money to give. Chris already knew that and said he only came to warn them. He told them not to touch his things, or he wouldn't go easy on them. The two were confused and asked if that was all. Chris let go of the girl and agreed that just warning them seemed a bit pointless. He then said he wouldn't ask for money, but instead he wanted information. He admitted that he had just arrived in the city and didn't know his way around. He wanted to know the way back to the central area. Ralph said it wouldn't be a problem if that was all Chris needed. Chris then asked the girl if she agreed, since she was the one directly involved. What Chris really needed was information about the city, which he didn't know. He then tried to ask for their names, but the two said they wouldn't tell him. Chris already knew their names though, because they had been shouting them earlier. Ralph was shocked and said he had no interest in being friends. Chris understood. Ralph and Hesta guided Chris around the city and took him to different stores. Afterward, Chris thanked them. Ralph mentioned that the store owners were not happy about their visits, but Chris still wanted to thank them. Ralph and Hesta tried to leave, but Chris stopped them. He said he wanted them to show him the most important place they knew. He asked where they were selling the items they had stolen so far. Ralph said it was at an acquaintance's pawn shop. Chris agreed that those shops buy stolen goods and asked why Ralph was telling him this. Chris then told them to just lead the way. The two were cautious, but Chris reassured them that he meant no harm. He admitted that he only wanted to sell some stolen goods. Ralph was shocked, realizing Chris was also a thief, and scolded him for stealing. Chris explained he only did it once, and it was with his father's belongings. Ralph didn't care who it was from. Stealing was stealing, and it was no different from what they were doing. Chris reminded them that he would ignore the disrespect they showed him if they helped him out. He also said that he only warned them not to steal from him and didn't care if they stole from others. Ralph then asked if Chris would really not report them to the authorities. Chris promised that he wouldn't, as long as they guided him. After thinking it over, the two thieves decided to take Chris to their last stop on the tour. The three of them went to the pawn shop, and the owner was surprised to see Ralph and Hesta bringing someone new. The old man stared at Chris and asked what was happening. Ralph explained that Chris was someone they had just met and wanted to sell something. He asked the old man if he could buy it. The old man wasn't sure about dealing with a stranger but agreed anyway. He asked for Chris's name, and Chris answered right away. The old man shook his hand and said Chris had a nice name. He introduced himself as Rugans. Chris placed his father's belongings on the table, and Rugans commented on how valuable everything seemed. He asked Chris to look around the shop while he appraised each item carefully. Chris looked at the swords, which were worth 5 gold coins. They looked great, but he didn't have enough money to afford them. Next, he checked the bookshelves and found a book he had never seen before called The Memoirs of Botanist Otto. The book didn't seem interesting, but Chris found himself drawn to it. He wanted to buy it if it was cheap, but it turned out to be worth 3 gold coins. It was an old, rare book, but the price was too high. Chris thought there must be something special about it. Hesta sneaked up behind him and asked if Chris could really read the characters in the book. Chris said he had been taught to read since he was little and asked if Hesta couldn't read. Hesta struggled to respond and then said it was nothing, which confused Chris. Rugans returned and said he had finished the appraisal. He said he would buy everything if Chris was okay with the prices. The earrings were priced at 2 silver coins and the ring was worth 4 silver coins. Surprisingly, the necklace was worth 3 gold coins, which shocked Chris. Rugans explained that the necklace had a small sapphire attached to it, making it valuable. Ralph was surprised, especially since he knew how careful Rugans was with money. He thought Chris must be from a rich family. Rugans told him not to interfere with his business. Finally, Rugans offered 1 gold coin for the pocket watch. Chris was shocked to learn that the pocket watch his father had treasured wasn't worth much. He stayed quiet for a moment, then decided to sell everything except the pocket watch. Chris thanked the old man for his help. Rugans explained that he had to lower the price because the items were stolen. He mentioned that he was also benefiting from the deal and told Chris not to worry. Then he asked if Chris needed anything else. Chris said there was one thing. He showed Rugans a book he had found earlier. Rugans was surprised because no one else had paid attention to it. He said he found the book interesting too because its content was fascinating. That's why he had set the price for it, but it had been years since he last looked at it. Because of the price, Chris thought the author must have been someone successful. Rugans laughed and said the author wasn't famous or accomplished. However, if a knowledgeable person read it, they might see the book as a masterpiece. That was his opinion, at least. Chris admitted that he had also become interested in the book. However, he didn't have enough money to buy it right then and asked Rugans if he could reserve it to purchase later. The old man told him he could pay later and just return to the shop when he had the money. Chris was confused, especially because Rugans's serious eyes made him uncomfortable. He asked if he could really do that, feeling awkward since he had just sold stolen goods. Rugans assured him not to worry, saying that not many people would offer such a deal. He explained that the book hadn't been sold in years, and if Chris took it without paying, he wouldn't be bothered. Rugans didn't care when Chris paid, but when he did, it would mean he finally sold the book that had been unsellable for so long. If Chris didn't pay, Rugans would just get the money from Ralph. Ralph, who had been listening, complained about it. Rugans then asked if Chris would take the book, and since the old man was offering, Chris agreed to buy it. Ralph tried to stop him, saying he would never pay, but Rugans just laughed. Afterward, Chris thanked Ralph and Hesta for helping him earn more money than he expected. Ralph mentioned that it was the same amount someone would usually make in a month. Chris then offered to treat them to some food, and Hesta's face lit up with excitement. Ralph called her a fool and reminded her that they hadn't stolen anything yet that day. Hesta argued that it was better to accept a free meal than to keep searching for things to sell. Ralph somewhat agreed, but he found it strange that Chris wanted to buy food for the very people who had tried to steal from him earlier. Chris explained that he was just thanking them for leading him to a good place. Hesta urged Ralph to accept the offer since they had no money anyway. Even though Chris didn't have much, after spending the past month living in the forest, he found it nice to have someone to talk to, even if they were thieves. The three of them went to a tavern and chatted while waiting for their food. When the food arrived, the two thieves were surprised to see Chris eating without holding back. Ralph joked that they had ordered the same meal, but Chris made his look more delicious. Chris explained that he had spent the past month eating nothing but orc meat without any seasoning. Disgusted, Ralph immediately told him not to mention orc meat again. Ralph was amazed to learn that Chris had survived in the forest with nothing. Chris explained that in the first few days he ate almost anything he could find and even drank muddy water. Ralph couldn't believe it and pointed out that poisonous plants could have been deadly. Chris said there was nothing to worry about because he had a skill called toxic resistance. Ralph was shocked that Chris mentioned his skill so casually in public. However, Chris didn't care since he thought it was a weak skill that didn't change anything. Ralph commented on how carefree Chris was, but warned him that not all poisons were harmless. He knew some people with the same skill, and they still had to be careful. Chris guessed that those people probably just had less stomach pain or fewer side effects, but Ralph wasn't sure, as he had noticed they were only slightly better at drinking alcohol than others. Chris then said he ate anything that looked suspicious, yet nothing ever happened to him. At that moment, Hesta realized why her aloe ball had no effect on Chris. Chris asked if she was talking about the red thing she threw straight into his eyes. Ralph was stunned because aloe balls contained a strong anesthetic, and Chris should not have been able to move for an entire day. Chris was shocked they were using something so dangerous. Since the aloe ball had no effect on him, Ralph guessed that Chris's toxic resistance had somehow turned into toxic nullification. Still, he warned that it wasn't something Chris should rely on too much. After the meal, Ralph asked Chris about his plans. Chris said he would become an adventurer for now since he knew some sword skills and needed money to survive. Ralph then mentioned that wanderers usually ended up as either adventurers or criminals. Chris asked if they had any plans for their future or if they planned to live by stealing forever. The two stayed silent for a moment before Ralph finally said that was his plan. Since they weren't strong enough to be adventurers, they had no choice but to dirty their hands. Chris thought that was a harsh thing to say, but he reminded them that if someone else had caught them instead of him, they could have been thrown in prison. He suggested they find a better way to live. The scene then shifted to the Adventurers Guild, where many people were going in and out. A beautiful receptionist greeted Chris and told him the registration fee was 1 silver coin. Without hesitation, Chris placed a silver coin on the desk. The receptionist explained that his personal information would be recorded using magic, then asked for his name and age. Chris introduced himself without his last name and said he was 26 years old. A magic crystal between them glowed, and the receptionist handed Chris his identification card, marking the completion of his registration. She explained that he could now accept quests and trade within the guild. His ID would keep track of his quest records, rank, and could also be used as a general form of identification. As the receptionist handed over the ID, she asked if Chris had any more questions. Chris wanted to know if he could take any quest he wanted. The receptionist advised him to start with beginner-level quests. The more quests he completed, the higher his adventurer rank would become. As his rank increased, he could take on more difficult quests. Chris then asked about the ranks the receptionist had mentioned. She explained that the ranks started at rookie level, followed by bronze, silver, gold, platinum, mithril, diamond, orichalcum, and finally scarletite. However, the last two ranks were extremely rare, so Chris didn't need to worry about them for now. Chris asked about the skills needed for each rank. The receptionist explained that it mostly depended on the right abilities and professions. It also relied on the number of completed quests and success rates, making it hard to give a definite answer. She mentioned that rookies started with a stat of 10, bronze ranks had 20, and the numbers kept doubling for each higher rank. Chris thanked her for the explanation and continued asking more questions. The receptionist answered all of Chris's questions professionally, but after a while she became tired from talking. She asked if he had any more questions, and Chris said he was satisfied, though she doubted it. Still, she wished him luck with his adventuring. Without resting, Chris picked up a quest to exterminate goblins. The reward was 2 copper coins per goblin, and he had to bring back their left ears as proof. He remembered how badly he failed his surprise attack against the orc before, but this time, he was determined to strike accurately. Chris sneaked up behind a goblin without being noticed. He locked his eyes on it and swung his sword. With a single slash, he cut the goblin in half. The creature collapsed, lifeless, in a pool of its own blood. However, Chris felt something strange. When he fought the orc before, the experience had been completely different. Even with a proper sword, slicing through a goblin so easily felt unreal. He didn't understand why, but he had a feeling he had gained some kind of extraordinary power. After becoming an adventurer, Chris spent the next 2 months hunting only goblins. One morning, as he woke up, he thought about how his life had mostly stayed the same since coming to the city, except for one thing. When he stepped out of his room, Hesta and Ralph greeted him. Chris had started living with these two thieves. A month ago, after being caught by Chris, the two had reached their limit as thieves and decided to visit him. Hesta asked if they could live together. There were cheap hostels in the city that allowed 3 people to share a room. Since Chris also wanted to save money, he agreed. The two had now become adventurers. Chris had no trouble getting food, clothing, or shelter, and the 3 of them had even managed to save up 3 gold coins. Recently, Chris had also ranked up from rookie to bronze. Chris had a theory he wanted to test in Pacia Forest. The book, The Memoirs of Botanist Otto, talked about how people in legends discovered useful effects from new plants. The book clearly recorded place names and plant knowledge in a simple and interesting way. What caught Chris's attention the most were notes about unknown plants with deadly poison. Some of these plants had extremely strong toxic effects that were not yet fully understood. However, among the plants Chris had eaten in the forest, there was one that seemed to make his body stronger. If that was true, he could become much more powerful. Chris visited a church to update his adventurer card. He wanted to check how his abilities changed before and after eating certain plants. He also wanted to know if he had any currency-related skills. Since he couldn't check these things by himself, he needed the church's help. However, it cost 1 gold coin to confirm any changes in his abilities. A priest greeted Chris and asked how he could assist him. Chris simply said he wanted his abilities checked. The priest assumed he was an adventurer and told him to enter the next room and wait. Inside the room, Chris saw a familiar crystal ball. He stared at it, hoping there was a way to test himself without spending a gold coin. After a short wait, the priest entered and apologized for the delay. He introduced himself as Graham, the parish priest of the church. Chris thanked him for the warm welcome. Graham mentioned that if Chris was there to confess, he wouldn't have time to listen, but Chris made it clear that he only came for the ability check. Graham had no issue with that and told him the cost was 1 gold coin. He then took Chris's adventurer card and placed it in front of the magic crystal. The crystal glowed brightly, and the check was complete. Graham handed the card back to Chris before excusing himself to attend a holy ceremony. Chris thanked him and then looked at his adventurer card. It showed that his most suitable profession was farmer. His physical strength was 10, while his magical strength was 5. His endurance was recorded as 7, and his magic power was only 1. Lastly, his agility was 4. His special skill was poison nullification, not resistance. However, he currently had no normal skills. Chris had hoped for higher numbers than the average level to defeat some orcs and goblins, but most of his stats were only single digits. Although the stats did not show his swordsmanship skills, they accurately represented his physical and magical strength at that moment. However, he noticed numbers in parentheses next to his stats. If his guess was right, these numbers showed how much his stats had increased after eating the strange plants. He also felt confused when he saw that his special skill was different from what was first announced. He wondered if the old parish priest had made a mistake when speaking. One early morning, Chris packed some things into a large bag. Hesta woke up and asked where he was going. He apologized for waking her and said he had some business to take care of. He told her he wouldn't be back for a while and asked her to inform Ralph. He also assured them not to worry since he had already paid the rent in advance. Hesta understood and promised to tell Ralph later. Chris then returned to Pacia Forest, which felt almost like his hometown. As he went deeper into the forest, he remembered how he once thought he could gain valuable survival experience without proper food and water. But in reality, he would have died long ago if not for his poison nullification skill. Chris reached his cave and noticed a dead bug. He wondered if it couldn't reproduce. After setting up his bedding and putting his big bag down, Chris started looking for some familiar plants. At the same time, he wrote some notes in his diary. Over the past 2 months, he had gathered information from equipment shops, pharmacies, and healing guilds. Now that he had some knowledge, he realized that the plants sold for food and medicine in Real Zad were also found in Pacia Forest. But this time, Chris was only there to verify this. He needed to gather the unknown plant species. If he remembered what he had eaten, it would save him a lot of time. But back then, he was only focused on surviving, so he didn't remember much. The only thing he remembered clearly was the taste of grilled mushrooms because they weren't that bad. As he chewed, he couldn't taste it well. But the sour aftertaste and the dry feeling on his tongue were really disgusting. Still, it was better than the bitter-tasting plants. Next, he found a creepy-looking plant with small tentacle-like things coming out of its mouth. Chris chewed on it and immediately felt a sour, rotten taste. He figured it was an insect-eating plant and thought the bad taste came from an insect that hadn't been fully digested. He quickly threw it up and decided it was inedible, but his goal was to gather 30 poisonous plant species, so he couldn't just give up easily. A week passed and Chris tried the plants he could find. He also collected various plants, not caring about how they looked. In just 1 week, he managed to gather 30 poisonous plants. When he thought about going back, he was a bit worried. However, deep in the forest, there were no magical beasts, and it turned out to be a peaceful place that was easy to live in. Chris decided his next visit would be more relaxing and he would think of it like a vacation, though the thought of eating those awful plants for every meal was discouraging. When Chris finally returned to Real Zad, it was as lively as ever. The priest was surprised to see him back so soon. Chris apologized for any trouble caused. He explained it had only been a few days and assumed there were no big changes in his abilities. But he said it wasn't a problem. Graham didn't mind seeing how willing Chris was. After a moment, Graham finished updating the adventurer card and handed it back to Chris. Chris expected the plants he brought back wouldn't do much, especially if nothing had changed on his adventurer card. But to his surprise, there were changes. Chris saw that his physical strength and endurance had both increased by 1. This showed that some of the plants he collected could boost his abilities. Now that he knew which plants could help, Chris was ready for his next step. He would do whatever it would take as long as it would help him be stronger. Chris returned home only to be met with Ralph's complaints. Ralph was upset because Chris had disappeared for a whole week without saying anything. Confused, Chris said he had told Hesta about it. Ralph admitted he heard it from Hesta, but he still felt that Chris should have told him personally. Ralph then asked where Chris had gone and angrily questioned if he was planning to leave their lodging. Chris told him to calm down, saying he never mentioned anything about leaving. To change the mood, Chris pushed a meat skewer into Ralph's mouth and handed Hesta her portion. Hesta thanked him, and Ralph seemed to settle down a bit. Chris then told them that if they ever became successful adventurers, they should invite him to something. Still, Ralph wasn't satisfied and kept asking where Chris had been. Chris realized Ralph wouldn't stop until he got an answer. He reminded them that he had mentioned going into hiding in the forest. He had only gone back for a week because something had been bothering him. Ralph asked what it was, but Chris didn't explain further and instead changed the subject by asking how their work as adventurers was going. The two went quiet for a moment before Ralph finally admitted that they were struggling. They only earned 1 silver coin for every 5 goblins they killed. Their rent was 4 silver coins per night and food cost around 6 silver coins. They barely had enough to get by each day. If they got injured and couldn't hunt 5 goblins a day, they would be in serious trouble. Chris agreed that it sounded tough but encouraged them to keep going. Ralph clenched his fists about to suggest something, but Chris cut him off, guessing he was about to talk about stealing. Ralph quickly denied it, saying he only wanted to suggest forming a party. Chris still refused, saying he didn't have enough money for that. Ralph didn't believe him. He pointed out that Chris had been gone for a week without working, yet he was still fine and had even bought meat skewers. Ralph assumed he must have some spare money. Hesta scolded Ralph for pushing the issue. Chris glared at them and said everything he had was because of his own hard work. If they didn't believe him, they could give back the food he had just shared with them. Realizing his mistake, Ralph apologized. Chris understood Ralph's feelings but didn't have enough extra money to help them. However, he saw an opportunity to benefit from them in some way, so he asked about their professions and skills without hesitation. Hesta and Ralph were confused because revealing their weaknesses could put them at a disadvantage. Still, they claimed their jobs were ordinary. Chris didn't mind and shared his own profession with them. He assured them there was no need to be cautious. If he had planned to kill them, he would have done it a long time ago. Hesta admitted that her profession was a wizard, and her skill was healing magic. Ralph, frustrated, asked why she had revealed it so easily. Hesta simply said it was fine because it was Chris. Wizards were part of the combat-related professions, but they were considered the strangest among them. It was known as an unconventional path. Controlling magic power was already difficult, but casting spells required study, either at a magic school or through self-learning with magic books. Only nobles or those given the highest level magic profession during the blessing ceremony could enter magic schools. Magic books were expensive and written in ancient script, which made them even harder to use. The ones sold to the public were overpriced. Chris commented that her profession was much better than his own as a farmer, and Hesta agreed. Knowing her skills had potential, she wanted to become a proper wizard. She explained that she had started stealing to earn money for magic books. That was why she had asked Chris if he could read back at the pawn shop. Hesta was surprised that Chris remembered the first day they met. She hesitated before speaking again. If she ever got a magic book, she wanted Chris to teach her how to read it. Chris recalled that wizards, once they learned magic, were not weaker than other combat professions. He realized Hesta could grow stronger in the future and agreed to help her learn to read. Hesta felt happy and smiled brightly. As Hesta thanked Chris, Ralph began to pout. Chris asked about his side of the story, but Ralph didn't want to share. Then Hesta casually revealed that Ralph was a holy knight. She also mentioned his skills: Divine Strike, Divine Guardian, and Breath of the Protector. Ralph couldn't believe she had just blurted out such important information. Chris was shocked to hear that Ralph was a holy knight. It was a high-ranking combat profession, one of the best. If they wanted, holy knights could join the royal guards. It was among the top professions that didn't require becoming a close-range guard. Yet they could still work as adventurers. Hesta then shared something personal. When Ralph was young, he had suffered a serious injury. He had hurt his knee so badly that he couldn't move properly because of the pain. Suddenly, Chris understood why Ralph's balance seemed off, even though he was smooth when drawing his dagger. Ralph, on the other hand, was shocked that his secret was now out. Chris guessed that the two of them must have struggled a lot when fighting goblins. Ralph agreed, saying they had been unlucky lately. But honestly, he wasn't even surprised. He had always been unlucky. Chris then wondered if things would be different if Ralph's knee healed. But Ralph disagreed. He explained that the village doctor back home couldn't fully treat his injury. Chris asked if Ralph had simply given up because of that. Ralph quickly denied it. He had searched for many doctors at first, hoping to find a cure. But in the end, no one could heal his injury. Chris claimed that it only happened when Ralph was little. a poor abandoned child with no status, trying his best but getting nowhere. Chris didn't know for how long, but since both Ralph and Hesta had potential, he agreed to form a party with them. However, Hesta and Ralph reacted differently. Chris himself had been abandoned by his family because of the blessing ceremony's results, yet now he judged others based on the same ceremony. Still, he said he didn't feel like teaming up with them as they were. Ralph asked what he meant, and Chris reminded them that he had his own goals. He told them they needed to be skilled enough to hunt goblins easily before they could form a party. Ralph protested, saying that was the reason he asked to team up in the first place. They weren't strong enough to hunt goblins properly. Despite Ralph's frustration, Hesta accepted Chris's condition. She looked serious, as if she understood what she needed to do. Ralph, on the other hand, reacted the opposite way. Chris was glad that a decision had been made, even if only Hesta agreed. Afterward, Chris went to the guild to look for quests. A receptionist told him he could now take on bronze-level quests and asked if he wanted to try one. Chris asked what kind of quests they were. The receptionist explained that there were many types of quests from bronze level and above. She then asked if he preferred quests that required fighting a large number of monsters or just a few. Chris said he only wanted to fight a few. The receptionist looked through the available quests and showed him 4 options. The quests involved defeating lost cattlebirds, baby lizards, bubble wisps in the abandoned village to the east, and hedgerow slimes found in the lower parts of the Mitria River. She told him that defeating just one of the monsters would be enough to complete the quest. Chris then asked why some quests had specific locations while others did not. The receptionist explained that quests without specific locations were given by people who needed materials from certain monsters. In these cases, adventurers had to bring back the monster's body or certain parts after defeating them. Chris guessed that the quests with set locations involved eliminating dangerous monsters. The receptionist confirmed this. She added that these quests often involved searching for the monsters, gathering information, defeating them, and then bringing back materials. These quests sometimes took longer, but they also offered better rewards. Chris asked which of the 4 quests had the highest reward. The receptionist said the Lost Cattlebird Extermination quest offered the most money. A meat processing shop had posted the request, and Chris needed to bring back the whole body of the creature. The base reward was 1 gold coin, but depending on the size and condition of the monster, the shop could pay up to 3 gold coins. This information surprised Chris. Next, he asked about the lowest paying quest. The receptionist told him that both the hedgerow slime and bubble wisp quests offered a reward of 4 silver coins. Chris realized that defeating just one of these monsters was as difficult as completing a task that required taking down 20 goblins. It became clear to him that bronze-level quests truly offered better pay. If he chose based on the reward alone, the Lost Cattlebird Extermination quest was the best option. However, the high payment likely meant it was also the most difficult. If he took too long to complete it, he might run out of money before finishing. In this situation, Chris had to decide carefully. Which quest should he take? The scene shifted to the riverside, where there were many bugs and different plants. Chris walked slowly through the woods beside the river, and soon found a strange blob-like creature. When he looked closer, he realized it was a hedgerow slime. As it moved, a terrible smell filled the air, making Chris feel disgusted. He had chosen this quest because it seemed easy. However, even if he managed to defeat the slime, its awful stench would stick to his weapons and equipment, possibly forcing him to throw them away. Chris wanted to give up, but since he barely had any money left, he had no choice but to keep going. The hedgerow slime was as tall as Chris, and inside its body, there was a dark spot. That was its core. He reminded himself to stay focused. Gripping the hilt of his sword, he dashed out from the woods, determined to end the fight in a single strike. He ran straight at the slime and stabbed through its body, hitting the core exactly. But the attack wasn't strong enough to break it. Chris quickly jumped back as the slime began shooting goo balls at him. While dodging, he regretted not finishing it in one blow. Deciding to try again, he sneaked behind the monster, swung his sword hard, and then thrust it forward. This time, the core shattered, and the slime exploded. Even though he had won, Chris didn't feel like celebrating. Slime goo had splattered all over him, covering him in its foul smell. As he washed himself in the river, he promised never to take this kind of mission again. After failing to use the hedgerow slime as a way to make money, Chris learned an important lesson. A month passed without any trouble as he completed bronze-ranked missions. In the afternoons, he worked on mission reports and prepared for the next day. The rest of his time was spent practicing swordsmanship and learning about plants at the healing guild and herb shops. Every day, Chris earned at least 4 silver coins and managed to save up 20 gold coins. Even though he had worked without much rest for a month, he never expected to earn so much. One day, Chris visited Rugence's pawn shop. The old man asked if he was there to buy a new weapon, as Chris had become a regular visitor. This time, however, Chris came to pay for the book he had taken earlier. He apologized for making Rugens wait. The old man asked if Chris had enough money now and said he could pay whatever he could afford. But Chris assured him there was no need to worry. He had more than enough. If he hadn't gotten Botanist Otto's book back then, Chris might never have realized how valuable those poisonous plants were. He was deeply grateful to Rugens for selling it to him. The old man had no choice but to accept the payment and thanked Chris. But Chris insisted he should be the one thanking him, as the book had been incredibly useful. After Chris made the payment, he said he had a question. The old man asked what it was. Chris wanted to know if he was selling any necromancy scrolls. As soon as he heard that, the old man's face and tone changed. He walked to the back, searched through a drawer, and pulled out some scrolls. He said they were old but were indeed related to necromancy. Chris asked what they were. Rugens explained that Hesta had specifically asked him to keep them and not sell them, so he had set them aside. Chris then asked why he didn't offer Hesta the option to pay later, like he did for him. Rugens replied that he only gave that offer to Chris because it was him. If he had given the scrolls to Hesta, she would have just taken them and run off without paying. Chris found it hard to believe. He thought they had known each other for a long time and should have built some trust. But the old man explained that was exactly why he couldn't trust her. Then he asked Chris if he wanted to buy the scrolls. Chris asked for the price. Rugens told him it was 2 platinum coins. The price shocked Chris. It felt like he had been struck by lightning. 1 platinum coin was equal to 10 gold coins, and he had never imagined the scrolls would be so expensive. He mentioned that he had heard of them being even pricier before. Rugens shared that he too had spent a whole day thinking about whether to buy them or not. In the end, he still hadn't sold them to anyone. On top of that, no one really came to their alley to shop, let alone buy something so rare and expensive. Because of the high price, he usually asked for payment in advance, but if Chris wanted to buy them, he would allow him to pay in full later. Chris was shocked. He had been given another chance to pay later. Chris planned to buy the necromancy scroll so Hesta could learn magic. Since she couldn't use magic yet, there was no hope for her. But if she learned even a little, she would become more useful. Teaming up with the ex-thieves could also benefit him. However, he couldn't afford to go into debt because of Hesta. Chris appreciated the old man's offer but refused this time. Rugens said it was a shame and told Chris he could come back any time if he wanted to buy the scroll. Chris thanked him and left. After that, Chris went home and placed several poisonous plants on the table. As he ate them, he thought about how he had some extra money and planned to visit the church later to check for any changes in his status. He had gathered these poisonous plants from the forest last time, dried them, and already eaten half. He took a bite of a leaf and immediately started trembling. The drier the plants were, the more bitter they tasted. Chris figured he needed to find another way to eat them. Last time, both his endurance and physical strength increased by 1. If they increased by another 1 this time, he could assume the remaining plants wouldn't improve his abilities any further, but if only one of them increased, it would be a problem. He could only hope he wouldn't be that unlucky. Graham was shocked to see Chris again. Chris realized that the church had no idea what he was doing. They probably thought he only came to ask for money. He apologized for bothering Graham once more. Graham wondered if this was another ability check, and mentioned that the last one hadn't been that long ago. Chris told him not to worry, saying he wouldn't be here if nothing had changed. Graham had no choice but to let him in. The update was quick, and Graham handed back the adventurer card. He reassured Chris that his determination would never fail, even if his abilities didn't improve. He hoped Chris would understand, but Chris only stared at him and said he already knew that. He asked Graham to stop repeating the same things. Graham felt a bit hurt and apologized for insisting. Then, he excused himself. This time, Chris actually saw an increase in his abilities. However, he noticed that only the left side had improved, while the right side stayed the same. He assumed the increase came from his efforts after a month of hunting monsters. He had hunted many over the past month, but the improvement was the same as when he ate the poisonous plants. He realized that some of those poisonous plants had the power to make him stronger. But this time, none of the ones he ate seemed to enhance his abilities. He feared that drying them might make them useless. For now, he decided to eat the remaining 15 types of poisonous plants and return for another check. When Chris got home, he saw Hesta and Ralph kneeling on the floor. Hesta looked serious while Ralph seemed nervous. Chris asked what they were doing. Ralph tried to say something, but Hesta smacked his head. She then glared at Chris and firmly said they were strong enough to fight goblins. She asked him to join their party. Chris noticed that lately the two had been resting at home after their quests instead of looking exhausted like before. He was surprised by how quickly they had improved. Understanding their determination, he agreed to go with them the next day to see their skills for himself. Hesta thanked him and then angrily told Ralph to do the same. After hesitating, Ralph also thanked Chris. Realizing that they could now handle goblins on their own, Chris saw that teaming up with them could benefit him too. He then pulled out some meat skewers, and Ralph's mood instantly changed. Both of them eagerly thanked Chris for the food. That night, Chris crossed out several plant names in his diary. Those were the poisonous ones that didn't help his abilities. He decided to ignore those 15 plants in the future. It had been a waste of money and effort, but since it was part of his training to become stronger, he didn't mind. Ralph noticed him and asked about the pile of dried grass. Chris casually said they were poisonous. Ralph couldn't believe it and angrily asked why he had brought such dangerous plants home. Chris simply said it was fine as long as he didn't eat them. Ralph then wondered if Chris was making extra money by selling them. Chris assured him he wasn't doing anything illegal. He admitted that they were for him to eat and reminded Ralph about his poison nullification skill. Even so, Ralph couldn't understand how Chris could stomach eating poisonous dried grass. Curious, he asked if they tasted good, but Chris immediately replied that they were terrible. The next morning, Chris and Hesta walked through a thick forest. Ralph struggled to keep up. He breathed heavily and his injured leg dragged behind him, slowing the group. Ralph, who was walking ahead, looked back at him with a cold expression. Chris saw Ralph struggling and offered to help, but Ralph refused, speaking in a way that made it clear he didn't want pity. Even though he tried to act strong, he was clearly exhausted. Chris grew frustrated with the slow pace and made it clear that if they couldn't work together, they wouldn't continue as a group. Ralph trembled, maybe from tiredness or embarrassment. Hesta didn't say anything, but her sharp glare stayed on him. Hesta smiled as she quietly watched Chris carry Ralph on his back. She wondered how she and Ralph would fight the goblins later. When the trio reached their destination, Chris challenged them to prove their skills by hunting goblins. Ralph and Hesta accepted the challenge. Before they started, Hesta reminded Ralph to follow their usual plan. Ralph agreed and told her to leave it to him. Chris watched as the two scanned the area filled with tall grass. Hesta took the lead until she signaled to stop. She pointed at a goblin standing alone behind the grass. Moving carefully, she sneaked up behind it and struck its head with a wooden stick. The goblin groaned in pain and turned around. When it saw Hesta, it smirked and started drooling. Hesta quickly ran, trying to get away. The goblin laughed, thinking it had won, but before it could react, Chris suddenly appeared from the grass. Caught off guard, the goblin froze for a moment. Just enough time for Chris to stab it through the chest with his sword. It collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Hesta stopped running and looked back at Chris. She then asked what he thought about their hunt. Though it might have looked clumsy, she said she was proud that they could take down goblins so easily. Chris had wondered how the two hunted goblins, but after watching them, he finally understood. Hesta would lure the goblins toward Ralph, who couldn't run, and then he would take them down. After seeing this, Chris agreed to join their party. The two were surprised. Hesta cheered with excitement while Ralph looked unsure. Ralph insisted that he could handle goblins on his own and didn't see a reason to form a party. Annoyed, Hesta scolded him, asking if he planned to spend his whole life as a rookie adventurer, only hunting goblins. Afraid of her nagging, Ralph quickly said he was just joking. Still reluctant, Ralph told Chris that he would rely on him as a teammate from now on. Chris replied that he expected the same from both of them. For now, he suggested they head home first and discuss the details later that night. Hesta agreed, but Ralph was confused. He pointed out that they had just formed a party and questioned why they weren't hunting together yet. Soon after, Hesta and Ralph returned home. Chris greeted them, but his tone was still cold. Ralph proudly showed the meat skewers they had brought for Chris. Chris responded that he had the same idea and mentioned that he had also bought some food earlier. After all, it was the day they officially formed a party. Ralph complained that they shouldn't have bought extra food, but having more meat skewers wouldn't have been a problem. However, to Ralph's surprise, Chris hadn't bought the usual skewers. Hesta and Ralph's eyes widened when they saw what was on the table. There were the town's famous pork buns, sashimi from a well-known shop, and even seasoned fried rice from a popular diner. For some reason, I can hear someone saying, "Hiya!" Anyway, Chris said that all the delicious food came from famous restaurants they had always wanted to try. Hesta, drooling, thought everything looked amazing. Ralph agreed with her. Then, he asked Chris if it was really okay for them to eat the food. Chris assured them that they could since they were now a party. Hesta and Ralph exchanged smiles before happily digging in. After their meal, Chris suddenly spoke in a serious tone. He asked what goals the other two had. Ralph and Hesta looked confused. Chris then clarified, asking if they had a clear purpose in life besides being adventurers. Ralph shrugged and said that as long as he could eat plenty of food, that was good enough for him. Hesta, on the other hand, wanted to become a mage and earn money. She hesitated, wondering if a personal goal was acceptable. Chris had no problem with that, but he then asked if she would leave them once she achieved her goal. Hesta thought about it for a moment and admitted that it would be a tough decision. She had no plans of leaving. Ralph, still confused, asked Chris to explain his own goal more clearly. Chris clenched his fist in anger and told them he wanted revenge on his younger brother. His dark expression made it clear. He was ready to kill. He also explained how he planned to do it while staying in the same group. Hesta, feeling uneasy, asked what he meant. Ralph then asked if he was really planning to kill his younger brother. Chris calmly said yes. Ralph told him to carry out his revenge on his own. In response, Chris said he wouldn't have brought it up if he could do it alone. Ralph, stumbling over his words, asked if Chris's target was really his younger brother. Chris stayed silent for a moment, his expression dark. Then he confirmed that his brother was indeed the target, and that he was one of the strongest people around. Hesta then asked if there was a reason behind his revenge. Chris explained his situation, and the two finally understood why he had fled to the dangerous forest. He claimed that if he hadn't tripped that day, he would have died. Whenever he thought about that moment, he couldn't bring himself to forgive Klaus. He knew that the next time they met, Klaus would definitely kill him. His grim expression showed how scared he was. The other two remained silent for a while. Hesta admitted that she could understand wanting revenge even if it was against family. Ralph also related to Chris's feelings since he had once harbored thoughts of revenge toward his late stepfather. However, he had no intention of helping Chris seek revenge. Chris was fine with that. He only wanted them to understand his situation. Then, Ralph remembered something and assumed that the dried grasses Chris had been keeping were poisonous and meant to kill his brother. Chris denied it, saying they were for his own use. He had never considered poisoning the sword god, and even if he could, he wouldn't choose that method. Ralph then asked what the dried grasses were for. Since they had already formed a party, Chris decided it was the right time to explain. He revealed that the poisonous herbs could bring out a person's hidden abilities. If consumed, they could gradually strengthen the body. Ralph had never heard of such plants before and questioned whether they really existed. Chris explained that only those with resistance to poison could discover them. He believed he might be the only one who had uncovered their true power. Ralph found that impressive in a way. Chris asked them again about their goals. Hesta wondered if simply becoming a mage and being useful to Ralph and Chris wasn't enough. Chris said it was fine as long as Hesta was happy with it. Then he turned to Ralph. Ralph flexed his muscles and declared that he wanted to become the strongest adventurer, someone everyone would recognize. He was caught off guard when Chris snickered. Chris said he had expected that answer from Ralph. Hesta was surprised to see Chris smiling. Embarrassed, Ralph blushed and told Chris not to make fun of him. But Chris assured him he wasn't laughing at him. In fact, if Ralph's goal was to become the strongest, then that meant their goals were the same. Ralph was confused. Chris explained that his younger brother was considered a once-in-a-century prodigy. His name was already well known, and soon he would be celebrated as a great hero. Ralph was shocked that Chris, despite hating his brother, still acknowledged his talent. That realization made Ralph understand that his goal wasn't just to become strong, it was to surpass Chris's brother. Hesta then summed up their goals. Chris sought revenge on his younger brother. Ralph wanted the strength to surpass him, and Hesta would support them both. Chris confirmed that their ultimate goal was to surpass Klaus, the sword god. He asked if anyone had objections, but there were none. For now, this unlikely group of adventurers consisted of a holy knight who could barely walk straight, a mage who couldn't use magic, and a farmer who was immune to poison. Together, they formed what might have been the weakest adventurer party, formed by a strange fate. Afterward, Ralph was shocked when he heard that Chris wouldn't do any quests with them. Chris said he had other things to do, but they couldn't even handle bronze-ranked quests at the moment. Ralph and Hesta couldn't argue with that, but Ralph angrily questioned why they even formed a party in the first place. Chris explained that their main priority was to heal Ralph's injury or help Hesta learn magic. That's when Hesta realized they wouldn't be teaming up until those issues were solved, and Chris confirmed it. For now, he planned to go with Ralph to see if his leg could really be healed. Ralph started worrying because he had no money for a checkup. Chris assured him that he would cover the costs and told them to focus on earning as much money as possible together. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Ralph burst into tears and thanked Chris. Chris, however, called him gross and said he was doing it for his own benefit too. Ralph couldn't believe his thanks was being brushed off so easily. Hesta asked what she should do while Ralph was getting checked. Chris said hunting goblins alone would be difficult. After thinking for a moment, he asked Hesta to gather information about a monster called the ox cowbird. He wanted to know where it lived and its weaknesses. He promised to pay her fairly based on how useful the information was. Hesta agreed to help but didn't want Chris to pay her since he was already covering his checkup fees. However, Chris didn't want to argue about money any longer. For now, he wanted to keep things clear. He said any job they took on together would have equal pay, and they would continue splitting food and lodging costs as usual. Hesta agreed and was thankful for the future reward. The group soon arrived at the clinic, where the doctor asked what was wrong. Chris explained that Ralph's leg needed to be checked. When the doctor touched the injured leg, Ralph groaned in pain. The doctor said the injury was serious and asked when it had happened. Ralph replied that it had been 7 years ago. The doctor explained that Ralph's ligament was completely torn. If left untreated for too long, the meniscus would also be damaged. Ralph assumed that a full recovery was impossible, but the doctor said otherwise. Ralph was shocked to hear that. The doctor then described the procedure. They would open the knee, transplant a ligament, and stitch it up. As for the meniscus, they could replace it with a metal slime oil. Ralph asked if the treatment would really work, and the doctor assured him that it would. However, they needed to cover the surgery cost and provide the metal slime oil. Chris asked about the cost. The doctor said the surgery alone would be 20 platinum coins. Ralph was stunned by the high price. Chris also commented on how expensive it was and asked if there was any other way. The doctor explained that Ralph's injury had been left untreated for too long, and that he could tell Ralph had been putting too much strain on his leg. If the injury had been treated right away, a potion might have been enough to heal it. Ralph felt down after realizing he had missed his chance. However, the doctor suggested a cheaper option, reconstructive surgery. Chris then had an idea and asked the doctor if there was a place cheaper than the clinic. That night, everyone returned home and Ralph silently went to bed. Hesta, worried about him, asked Chris if Ralph's injury had no chance of healing. Chris assured her that wasn't the case. When Hesta asked why Ralph seemed so upset, Chris simply called him an idiot. Confused, Hesta asked what had happened, so Chris explained that the Healers Guild could treat Ralph, but it would cost 20 platinum coins. However, the doctor had mentioned someone named Blood. Since the doctor was part of the Healers Guild, he couldn't give more details. The next day, Chris and Ralph went around gathering information about Blood. They learned that he was once the most skilled healer in the Healers Guild. However, after realizing he could make a fortune on his own, he left the guild and became a wandering healer, charging high prices for his treatments. At first, many desperate patients sought him out, but over time, as medicine and medical technology improved, his methods became outdated. Now he barely got by in the back streets of the capital, treating the poor for whatever little money they could spare. Chris believed Blood got what he deserved. After hearing all this, Ralph decided Blood wasn't worth the effort and sulked. However, considering how much blood had fallen, he might be willing to do the surgery for an extremely low price. Hesta finally understood why Ralph was acting that way. Chris then told Hesta that Blood was in the royal capital, the same place where his younger brother Klaus lived. There was a chance they might run into him. Since Ralph wouldn't be able to negotiate on his own, Chris offered to cover the travel expenses and asked Hesta to go with Ralph. Hesta agreed and told him to leave it to her. The next day, Chris watched as the two left. Hesta and Ralph went their separate ways. Meanwhile, Chris returned to the church and reviewed his stats. After checking the numbers, he realized he had finally mastered identifying plants that could increase stats. Once the others were gone, he decided to go to Bayan Forest to collect poisonous plants and look for new ones. The first plant he found was a small purple flower that boosted stamina. It didn't look poisonous at first, but a dead animal nearby proved otherwise. It must have contained a lethal poison. Next, he discovered a mushroom that clearly looked dangerous. Surprisingly, this one increased endurance. So far, he had found plants that improved stamina and endurance, but what he needed most was one that increased strength. Based on his stats, there should be one somewhere in Bayan Forest. Afterward, Chris returned to his cave in the forest. He thought about moving to a new location, but there were still many plants he hadn't gathered yet. No people, animals, or even monsters had been around, so he decided to stay for now. His main goal was to focus on the two plants he had already identified. He named them Raisin Grass and Genpei Mushroom. He made sure not to harvest everything and carefully recorded where they grew. He wanted to grow them himself, but staying at the inn made that impossible. Renting a field was an option, but if people discovered he was cultivating poisonous plants, he would be arrested. Buying his own house was the best solution, but that was still far out of reach. Right now he had too many expenses: expeditions, ability identification, Ralph's treatment, and Hesta's magic book. At the very least, he needed enough money for those 4 things while also saving up for a house. However, no matter what he did, he never had enough money. He needed a faster way to earn income. That night, Chris finished cooking a stew using gay mushrooms. The mushrooms tasted good, so he simply added them to the stew without hesitation. The problem, however, was the raisin grass. Hesta had taught him to wrap the leaves in an oblat, a thin, edible film that helped swallow things without tasting them. This product was popular because it allowed bitter or unpleasant foods to be eaten easily. Though hesitant, Chris swallowed the wrapped grass. He confirmed that the oblat worked as expected, allowing him to consume the plant without suffering. It was his first time enjoying poisonous herbs as food. 5 days later, Chris had gathered enough gay mushrooms and raisin grass, along with 2 new plants that might be useful. He hoped one of them could increase strength. Just as he had that thought, something felt wrong. A chill ran down his spine and cold sweat dripped from his forehead. He quickly hid behind a tree. He had spent a lot of time in the forest, but this was the first time he had seen it. At first he thought it was just a rumor, but the rumor was true. A monster walked past the tree he was hiding behind. Chris held his breath, making sure not to make a sound. It was a massive bear-like creature with sharp claws and fangs. Flames blazed along its back. This was the ruler of Bayan Forest. Its name was Duke Urs. Duke Urs sniffed around, searching for something. Chris slumped against a tree, staying silent. This monster saw anything in its path as prey, and once it marked a target, there was no escape. It would chase its victim to the ends of the earth, tearing it apart with its sharp claws before finishing it off with its powerful jaws. Suddenly, Duke Urs noticed something and swung its massive paw at a tree. The tree snapped instantly, but nothing was behind it. The monster kept sniffing the ground, still searching. Chris held his breath, trying to stay calm as he remained hidden. He couldn't believe how things had taken such a terrible turn when everything had been going smoothly just a while ago. Duke Urs continued scanning the area, and Chris knew he would be found soon at this rate. No escape plan came to mind. Running was useless against a beast like this. If things went south, he had no choice but to strike first. Chris quietly climbed onto a nearby tree branch and waited for the monster to move directly below him. When the moment was right, he jumped down, aiming his dagger at the creature. He landed hard on the monster's back, driving the blade in with the full force of his fall. His timing and position were perfect, using gravity to his advantage. But it didn't work. Duke Urs remained unharmed. The monster quickly countered, swinging its massive claws. Chris was sent flying into a nearby tree and pain shot through his body. Luckily, he had blocked the claws with his sword, preventing a fatal injury. Duke Urs didn't stop. It charged at him like a speeding truck, roaring before attempting to bite his head off. Chris barely managed to block with his sword again. Desperate, he reached into his bag, grabbed a handful of poisonous herbs, and tossed a stalk into the monster's mouth. If the raisin grass didn't take effect soon, this could be the end for Chris. In just a few seconds, Duke Urs felt something was wrong. Its body became paralyzed, and Chris quickly stepped back. The monster then coughed up a huge amount of blood, holding its face as if trying to stop itself from vomiting while glaring at Chris. He could see that the poison from the raisin grass was working. Chris reminded himself to stay calm no matter what. Since the monster couldn't move, this was the perfect chance to attack. However, he was still injured from the earlier attack. First, he calmly drank a healing potion. Then he planned to finish the fight with a single strike before Duke Urs could counterattack. Chris and Duke Urs glared at each other for a moment. Then Chris dashed forward, gripping his sword tightly. Duke Urs roared and charged at him, swinging its claws. Chris managed to dodge just in time. He quickly reached into his bag, making Duke Urs hesitate and cover its mouth. Chris smirked and said it was too bad. It was a feint. Before the monster could react, he struck, driving his sword deep into its chest. But his weapon snapped against the creature's thick skin. Duke Urs raised its massive paws, ready to strike. Chris thought it was over. But before the attack landed, the monster suddenly collapsed with a loud thud. Blood poured from its mouth. Chris stood frozen, gasping for air. His legs gave out and he sank to the ground, staring at the fallen beast. A heavy sigh of relief escaped him. Just moments ago, he thought he was going to die. Days later, Chris finally returned to town. Hesta welcomed him back while Ralph casually drank something. However, both of them froze in shock when they saw Chris in a complete mess. They immediately asked if he was okay. Chris explained that he had been attacked by a monster in the forest. He defeated it and ran straight home without even washing up. He couldn't afford to rest because there was a chance he might be attacked again. Hesta, looking worried, asked if he was injured. Chris admitted that he got hurt a little, but it wasn't anything serious. Hearing the word monster, Ralph assumed it must have been a terrifying experience. He wondered if Chris would even be able to return to the forest. Chris reassured them that there was nothing to worry about. He had made sure to finish off the monster so he could go back whenever he wanted. The two couldn't believe he still planned to return. Ralph told him they wouldn't stop him, but he warned Chris not to dare die on them. Hesta quickly nodded in agreement. Chris smirked and assured them he had no plans of dying. Ralph reminded him that they were all part of the same team now. In response, Chris shoved a meat skewer at Ralph and told him to shut up and eat. The moment Ralph saw the food, his mood changed, and he instantly became cheerful. Chris sighed, thinking Ralph was a hassle, but at least he was easy to handle. Chris asked Hesta about her progress. She told him that she had found Blood, who was now living in the black market and struggling with money. At first, Blood demanded 15 platinum coins for the job, but Hesta kept rejecting the price. In the end, Blood, desperate for work, lowered his price to just 5 platinum coins. Chris was surprised to hear this and said they could make things work at that price. However, Hesta still thought 5 platinum coins were too expensive. Chris then reminded her of their agreement when they teamed up, to heal Ralph's leg and help Hesta learn magic. Hearing this made Hesta's face light up, and she loudly thanked Chris. Chris was caught off guard and felt a little flustered. Then he seemed to realize something. Hesta noticed and asked what was wrong. Chris told her not to speak so formally to him since they were the same age and equal as teammates. Hesta paused for a moment before saying she still preferred to use formal speech. Chris didn't mind, as it didn't really matter to him. Ralph had been eating when he suddenly asked Chris a question. Chris told him not to talk with his mouth full. Ralph then asked about Chris's progress and wondered if he had defeated the monster he had faced. Chris simply confirmed that he had gathered some loot but was attacked the day before he returned home. He then pulled out some sacks from his magic bag. Ralph asked if they were all filled with poisonous herbs, and Chris confirmed they were. Ralph hesitated for a moment but still asked his question. He wanted to know why Chris was going through so much trouble, even though he was already stronger than him. Chris told him not to complain, explaining that if he didn't get stronger, he wouldn't be able to make money to support them. Ralph didn't ask any more questions and simply gave up, but he swore to become stronger. The next day, Chris went to the mountains alone. He looked around and confirmed that he had reached his destination. He was back to adventuring, and this time his target was the ox cowbird. According to Hesta, the best place to find an ox cowbird was the small eastern plains. However, that area was open and full of hunters. Instead, Hesta suggested a different spot, the northwestern abandoned mines where only a few people would hunt. Chris searched the area until he spotted a creature that matched the description. A cow-like monster with large white wings was eating alone. Suddenly, it flapped its wings and stood on alert. Chris quickly hid and checked if it fully matched Hesta's details. It was his first time seeing an ox cowbird. He gripped his sword, preparing for battle. Although it was known as a food source, he had never tried eating one before. The monster had wings but couldn't fly. However, it had strong jumping abilities. If he dropped his guard, it could take him down with a body press. If he kept his distance, it would charge at him with its sharp horns. To defeat it, he had two choices: stay far enough to avoid its charge or stay close and dodge its body press. Chris sneaked behind the monster. When he got close enough, he tightened his grip on his sword and swung it. The monster noticed him, but it was too late. Chris had already slashed one of its back legs. It let out a painful cry. Chris quickly pulled a hammer from his bag. He swung it upward and then jumped over the monster. The blow finished it off. Without wasting time, he hung the monster on a nearby tree to drain its blood. He remembered that if the monster wasn't killed properly, the materials would lose value. The best way was to knock it out with a strike to the head before preparing it. Afterward, he buried the useless organs. Now, his biggest problem was carrying the monster back. The request only required the fillet, tongue, and sirloin steak. Cutting them on site would make the load lighter, but he hesitated. Night fell and the townspeople's attention turned to something unusual. A knock echoed at the butcher shop's door, and the owner stepped out. He started to apologize as the shop was already closed, but his words stopped when he saw an ox cowbird at his doorstep. Shocked, the butcher panicked and asked what was going on. Chris walked in, carrying the entire monster's body on his back. He introduced himself as an adventurer who had accepted a request to hunt an ox cowbird. Since it would have been a waste to leave parts behind, he decided to bring the whole thing with him. The butcher, still shaken, recognized Chris and slowly calmed down. After examining the carcass, the butcher noted that it was a large one. The blood had been properly drained and the organs were neatly removed, keeping the meat fresh. He even said it might have been the best ox cowbird he had ever seen. Chris asked if it was really that impressive. The butcher confirmed, explaining that most people didn't bring the entire creature, and few adventurers could process a carcass so cleanly. Chris then asked if he could sell it for a high price. The butcher assured him it was possible but needed to cut it up first. He called out to someone named Nathaniel and told him to bring something for Chris to clean himself up. He also asked Nathaniel to grill some meat for Chris. When Chris said he wouldn't pay for it, the butcher told him not to worry and to consider it a handling fee. He promised to call him back after appraising the meat and suggested he eat and wait in the meantime. Chris walked back home feeling surprised. The reward turned out to be 5 gold coins, and he even got to eat free meat. The request originally offered a maximum of 3 gold coins, but since the item was in good condition and quite large, they increased the reward. Gathering information had been difficult, but the task itself only took a day. Normally, a bronze-ranked quest paid 4 silver coins, but this time, Chris earned 12 times that amount. He couldn't help but smile. At this rate, he would save up money in no time. A month passed, and Chris kept hunting ox cowbirds. The monster was difficult to find, so he could only hunt one every 4 days. He realized that finding one on his first day had just been pure luck. Even so, the hunt was more rewarding than other quests, so he kept going and managed to earn 26 gold coins in a month. With that money, he bought something important. Chris approached Hesta, who was practicing reading and writing. Her hands trembled as she held a book, and her eyes widened in amazement. Ralph curiously asked about the old, dirty book. Hesta excitedly explained that it was a magic book. Chris then revealed that he had saved up enough money to buy it. He explained that if they kept earning so little from hunting goblins, it would be a problem for all of them. Hesta suddenly remembered the times when she had been hungry, and had even begged Rugans not to sell the book until she could afford it herself. Overcome with emotion, she burst into tears and thanked Chris, not just for buying the book, but for looking out for her. She said no amount of gratitude would be enough to repay him. Chris, however, told her he wasn't looking for thanks. Instead, he urged her to learn magic quickly and become useful to the party. Hesta wiped her tears and made up her mind. She would definitely master magic. Chris smiled, seeing how much the once crybaby girl had changed. Ralph asked what the magic book was about. Chris explained that it was a book that could help someone learn magic. He hadn't read it yet, but it would probably explain a lot about magic. Ralph got excited knowing that Hesta could finally learn magic, but his excitement quickly faded and his expression turned gloomy. Chris noticed and asked what was wrong. Ralph admitted that if Hesta learned magic, he was afraid he would be the only useless one left behind. The thought made him a little scared. Chris sighed and pointed out that Ralph wasn't acting like himself. He jokingly reminded Ralph that he was already a burden but still had fun messing around. Ralph hesitated but somewhat agreed. Chris then reassured him that it would be Ralph's turn after Hesta. He explained that Hesta's magic would help them take on bronze-ranked quests and earn more money. Ralph was surprised that he hadn't thought of that before. After a moment, he nodded and said he understood. Chris read the magic book out loud for Hesta. He said that before using magic, a person should first learn how to control their magic power. He compared it to imagining water flowing through the body, slowing it down and speeding it up repeatedly. Chris only read what he could understand. Somehow, Hesta grasped the idea from what Chris had just read and decided to give it a try. Chris and Ralph closed their eyes, wondering if they could do the same by copying her. The room fell silent. Chris didn't feel anything except sleepiness. He eventually opened his eyes to check on Hesta and asked how she was doing. To his surprise, Hesta was releasing magic power that surrounded her, visible to the naked eye. Both Chris and Ralph were shocked. Chris, now worried, asked if she was okay. Ralph questioned what was happening. Hesta assured them she was fine and explained that the energy around her was magic power. She then raised her left hand and said she was starting to get a feel for it. Chris wondered if it was normal to grasp something like this so quickly after just a short explanation. He warned her not to destroy their place. Hesta told him not to worry because she was controlling her magic just fine. Suddenly, she released a surge of magic power, causing Chris and Ralph to panic. Seeing their reaction, Hesta stopped teasing them, and the magic surrounding her disappeared. She let out a sigh. Chris, still speechless, now understood why the ritual of heavenly grace had given her the title of mage. The next day, the group went to the forest. As usual, Chris read from the book. It explained that imagination was the most important part of using magic. The first step was to light a candle and focus on its flame while trying to turn magical power into fire. Chris repeated what was written on the page. Hesta decided to give it a try. She placed her left hand near the candle's flame while attempting to create fire in her right hand. Meanwhile, Chris turned to Ralph and asked why he had joined them. Ralph simply said he was bored and had nothing else to do. Chris wasn't sure if that was the real reason, but he suggested giving Ralph some sword training while they waited for Hesta. At first, Ralph was confused and asked if Chris was serious about teaching him. Chris admitted he didn't actually want to train Ralph. He was worried Ralph might surpass him, but he kept that thought to himself. Ralph, excited, said he had never received proper sword training before and would be grateful if Chris mentored him. He then started calling Chris his master and asked him to teach him well. Hearing those words, Chris suddenly remembered something painful. In that distant memory, he lay injured on the ground while young knights begged his father to train them. He froze for a moment before telling Ralph to stop calling him that. He said it was so disgusting that it made him feel sick. Ralph couldn't understand why Chris was being so harsh toward him. Chris helped Ralph with his swordsmanship training. They clashed swords, but Ralph quickly fell when Chris tripped him. Chris noticed that Ralph moved smoothly, but he lacked the basics. Before improving, Ralph needed to master the fundamentals. Since he was a holy knight, he would grow stronger quickly once he did. Just then, Hesta called Chris over and showed him how she had successfully lit a fire using magic. Ralph was amazed by her achievement. Chris was also surprised. Less than 20 minutes had passed, and she had already learned magic. He wondered if Hesta was naturally talented or if magic was just that easy to learn. Chris turned to the next page of the book and instructed Hesta to practice making the fire float. Hesta then asked if she could start learning more advanced magic. Chris questioned if she wanted to skip the basics. He didn't mind if that was her choice. Hesta confidently said she had already gotten the hang of it, so she believed it was fine. Chris understood her feelings. He didn't want Ralph to struggle unnecessarily just to get stronger either. However, his own pride wouldn't allow him to fall behind. Determined, Chris decided to do better too. The days passed. During the day, Chris hunted owlbirds, and at night, he helped Hesta with magic and trained Ralph in swordsmanship. Before he realized it, 2 weeks had gone by. Hesta quickly mastered all ball-type spells of the 4 elements, including Fireball. Ralph also improved a lot. Out of 50 matches, he finally managed to defeat Chris once. Meanwhile, Chris discovered a plant that boosted physical strength and named it the Rizaf fruit. Later, Chris went to Hesta and asked if she was practicing magic again. Hesta said she was and asked if Chris was joining her. Chris said he was, but had an idea to share with Hesta and Ralph. He suggested evaluating their abilities. Hesta asked what he meant. Chris explained that it was a ritual to measure a person's physical abilities, similar to the ritual of heavenly grace. Ralph questioned if such a ritual really existed. Chris confirmed it did, but said it wasn't free. They would have to pay. Ralph asked about the price. Chris said it cost 1 gold coin. Everyone went quiet for a moment until Ralph reacted in shock, complaining that it was too expensive. Frustrated, he asked who would spend that much just to check their abilities. He argued that it wouldn't even help them get stronger. Chris agreed, but explained that the evaluation could give them a clear and detailed understanding of their current abilities. Ralph insisted that they wouldn't have any trouble even without knowing their exact power. Hesta agreed and also pointed out that 1 gold coin was too much. Chris, however, said it wouldn't hurt to know their abilities. If they could see how much they needed to improve, they could train more effectively. For now, he offered to pay for it. Ralph refused, saying he would rather spend a gold coin on 10 days' worth of luxurious meals. Chris wondered who would waste a whole gold coin just to spoil Ralph. He made it clear that while he wouldn't force Ralph to get evaluated, that didn't mean he would just hand over a gold coin instead. Ralph sighed, realizing he might not have a choice. Hesta agreed to go since Chris was covering the cost. Chris then suggested they should leave before the church closed. Hesta quickly followed while Ralph hesitated. In the end, he decided to tag along, thinking of it as a free meal. Later at the church, Graham was surprised to see Chris visiting with a group. Chris told him that he wanted the 2 people behind him to have their abilities evaluated. Graham understood and asked for their adventurer cards along with 2 gold coins. Afterward, Ralph and Hesta checked their adventurer cards. Chris asked if everything showed up correctly. Hesta said it looked fine and was surprised that all the details were recorded so thoroughly. Ralph, on the other hand, was shocked to see that his abilities were lower than he had expected. Chris then asked Ralph to show him the card. Ralph hesitated for a moment and asked Chris not to laugh. Chris promised he wouldn't. When he looked at Ralph's adventurer card, he saw that Ralph was indeed a holy knight with a special skill called Divine Protection and normal skills, Holy Strike and Guardian's Roar. It was just as Chris had expected, but Ralph was still quite strong. Ralph nervously asked for Chris's opinion. Even though Ralph had only hunted goblins so far, his stats were already high. Once he started fighting different kinds of monsters, his abilities would improve even more. He lacked stamina, endurance, and agility, but that was likely due to his leg injury. Chris stared at Ralph for a moment, making him nervous. Then he told Ralph that his stats were exactly what one would expect from a holy knight. He even said that once Ralph's leg healed, he might surpass him. Ralph felt confused. He wondered if his abilities and stats were considered high. Since his strength was only 10, he thought he was weak. Chris admitted that he had only seen his own abilities, so he wasn't sure what was good or bad. Chris then asked to see Hesta's adventurer card. As expected, her magic power stat was high since she was a mage. She also had a special skill called Magic Recovery and a normal skill called Magic Surge. Chris wasn't surprised by her magic power, but felt confused when he saw Magic Surge. He asked Hesta if it was mentioned during the Ritual of Heavenly Grace because he didn't remember her talking about it. Hesta also found it strange. The ritual hadn't mentioned Magic Surge, but she assumed the priest either ignored it or forgot to tell her. Chris had experienced something similar. He was told he had poison resistance during the ritual, but it turned out to be poison immunity. He figured that Hesta's normal skill wasn't something granted by the ritual, but something she had from birth. Ralph wondered if he was actually stronger than Hesta or if his abilities weren't as low as he had thought. Chris agreed that it might be true and revealed that Ralph's stats were actually higher than his. Ralph didn't believe him and asked to see his adventurer card, saying it would only be fair. Chris didn't mind and showed his card to both of them. As expected, Ralph was confused when he saw how the stats were split in an unusual way. Chris explained that the numbers on the left showed his original abilities, while the numbers on the right showed the boosted abilities from another power. Ralph asked what he meant by that. Chris explained that his abilities increased because of a special plant he ate every day. Ralph was shocked that the dried grasses he had seen had such strong effects. He called it unfair and demanded to have some too. Chris reminded him that the plants were poisonous and said he could eat them if he was ready to die. Ralph had no response. Chris then pointed out that Ralph was actually luckier since he had received the title of a holy knight. Ralph felt embarrassed for a moment but quickly decided to focus on working harder to become stronger. Chris agreed that it was the best thing to do. Afterward, in town, Ralph and Hesta got ready for something important. They were finally moving on from hunting goblins and taking on bronze-ranked quests. Chris would go with them but only watch from behind. Their quest was to hunt a group of loud frogs in the southwestern fields. These creatures were large frog-like monsters that croaked loudly. Their main attack was stomping from high jumps, and their mucus carried a mild poison that caused numbness and pain when touched. Fighting one was easy, but dealing with a whole group was more challenging. Still, it was a good test for a bronze rank. Hesta asked Ralph if he remembered their plan. Ralph thought for a moment and recalled that he was supposed to handle the frogs that came close while Hesta took care of the ones farther away. Hesta confirmed he was right. Ralph started to worry and asked Chris if such a simple plan would really work. Saying it out loud made him doubt it even more. Chris flicked his forehead and told him to stop whining so much. Ralph protested, saying Chris didn't understand how scary the quest was for them. But Chris simply told them it would be fine and urged them to keep going. As time passed, Hesta quickly mastered arrow-type magic spells after first mastering all the ball-type spells. Ralph also made great progress with his daily sword training. They kept hunting goblins until Hesta learned the arrow-type spells. By then, both had become strong enough to defeat bronze-ranked monsters without trouble. Chris only accompanied them, knowing they wouldn't be in danger no matter what happened. Not long after, the group came across the Loud Frogs. Ralph felt excited to fight something other than goblins, especially since these creatures weren't even humanoid. Before they started, Chris reminded them to follow their training, keep their distance and aim carefully. The two understood and prepared for battle. Hesta and Ralph silently stared at the Loud Frog, which stared back at them. Chris had heard that Hesta's magic could defeat a goblin in one hit, but this was his first time seeing it in real combat. Suddenly the Loud Frog attacked, leaping high into the air. Chris chose not to interfere, but he grew worried when he saw that Hesta and Ralph were too focused on it and hadn't noticed the others approaching from the sides. Realizing the danger, he quickly called out to Hesta, warning her that two Loud Frogs were coming from the right. He told her to leave the one in the air to Ralph and take care of the ones on the right. Though flustered, Hesta quickly formed a ball of wind in her palm and fired it at the approaching Loud Frogs. One of them was instantly destroyed, leaving Chris speechless. He couldn't believe such a small spell had that much power, especially since it was a beginner-level spell. He wondered if Hesta was holding back to avoid damaging the surroundings, as the spell looked smaller than the one she used in training. Either way, Chris was relieved to have her on his side, though he now knew he had to be extra careful when facing magic users in the future. Hesta then finished off the second Loud Frog and proudly told Ralph. Meanwhile, Ralph had successfully defeated the first Loud Frog. Though he looked exhausted, he had still managed to take down a monster on his own. Chris smiled, realizing that even though he had given instructions, the two had handled the Loud Frogs with ease. Now that the tension had settled, they should be able to finish the job without any trouble. Soon after, the three of them stood in the middle of the dead Loud Frogs. They only needed to defeat 20, but they ended up taking down 30 in total. Hesta began calculating their reward. For each extra frog, they would earn 1 copper coin. That meant they would receive 6 silver coins in total, with each of them getting 3 silver coins. Ralph cheered. Until now, their daily earnings barely covered their living costs, which were 5 copper coins. But today, they had earned more than 10 times that amount. Chris had walked the same path as them, so he fully understood how they felt. Ralph told Chris that he might have gotten stronger. Chris reminded him that he was the one who trained him, so it was only natural for him to improve. From his point of view, it was strange that they had been so scared earlier. Ralph then admitted that no matter how much he trained, he could only beat Chris once in a dozen tries. He wondered how he could feel confident after losing so many times. Chris told him he was underestimating himself. Even though Ralph's stats were high and his most suitable job might be a farmer, Chris had trained in swordsmanship since childhood. He knew that someone with a leg injury wouldn't win that easily. At that moment, Ralph finally understood. He wasn't weak, Chris was just strong. Chris paused, looking serious, then told Ralph to have at least a little confidence in himself. Chris knew there were plenty of people stronger than him, but there was no reason to mention that now. Ralph might not be the smartest, but he tended to overthink things. If he got too confident, he became annoying, but if he got too discouraged, he was just as bothersome. It was a tricky balance. Chris turned his attention to Hesta and mentioned that her magic was in good shape. It was his first time seeing magic used against a monster, but with Hesta's current strength, he believed she could even handle silver-ranked monsters. Hesta shook her head, saying she still had a long way to go. She remembered how she would have been in trouble if Chris hadn't warned her about the approaching monsters. Since she didn't have much combat experience yet, she planned to keep improving by fighting different monsters at the bronze rank. Hesta was quite serious, but at least Chris didn't have to worry about her becoming overconfident and making mistakes. She learned magic quickly, and was good at analyzing things on her own. Unlike Ralph, she would grow stronger even without Chris watching over her. Chris told them that he wouldn't be joining them anymore after this quest, and asked them to continue handling quests on their own. Ralph said they wouldn't have any trouble as long as they kept up their pace like before. Hesta assured him that they wouldn't let their guard down and would complete more quests properly. Chris then reminded them to save up 5 platinum coins to heal Ralph's leg injury. After that, they could finally function as a full-fledged party. Ralph had never imagined saving that much while earning only 5 copper coins a day, but now he could see it happening. Hesta also promised to do her best. The days passed as Hesta and Ralph continued hunting on their own and training with Chris afterward. Meanwhile, Chris focused on hunting as many owlbirds as he could. They all saved the money they earned from their quests, and everything was going smoothly. They were finally just 5 gold coins away from their goal. At that point, Ralph and Hesta asked Chris to leave the rest to them. Without hesitation, Chris agreed and spent a week alone in the Beyond Forest. A week later, he returned home wondering if the two had managed to earn the 5 gold coins by themselves. As he opened the door, he found Hesta and Ralph kneeling with serious expressions. Confused, Chris asked if they had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for him. Hesta glared at him and called him out. She then held out her hands, revealing 5 gold coins. She proudly stated that they had saved the last 5 gold coins safely, and thanked Chris for everything he had done for them. Ralph then admitted that at one point, he had thought they didn't need to team up with Chris, but now, he was truly glad they had. Chris, however, told them that they hadn't accomplished anything yet. If they wanted to thank him, they should wait until they had truly achieved something. He felt embarrassed by the situation. Ralph insisted that they were only expressing their gratitude. Not only had Chris paid for Hesta's magic book, but he had also covered the cost of Ralph's surgery. They were both truly grateful to him. In response, Chris simply told them that if they were really that thankful, they should pay him back someday. After all, making them stronger was something that benefited him as well. Hesta said they could repay Chris someday with their current progress and skills. However, if they had never met him, they wouldn't have come this far. Ralph added that it was all thanks to Chris that they realized someone could grow from almost nothing to great heights. But taking the first step was the hardest part. They both agreed that this was a debt of gratitude that money could never repay. Chris felt a bit embarrassed but understood how they felt. He told them to keep getting stronger. That would be their way of thanking him. The two eagerly agreed. Hesta then asked when Chris planned to go to the royal capital. Chris said he would probably go after saving up more money. Ralph was confused since he thought Chris would leave right away. Chris reminded him that the doctor from the Healers Guild had also mentioned needing metal slime oil. More importantly, they needed extra money for travel expenses. The two had completely forgotten about that. Chris assumed they had already planned everything out since they promised to handle the rest, but it turned out they had only saved exactly 5 gold coins for the surgery. They admitted they had forgotten about the cost of travel. Chris assured them there was no need to rush. If it was just for travel expenses, they could save up quickly. Before going to sleep, Ralph shared how excited he was to finally move freely again. Chris reminded him that he still needed rehab before he could move properly. Ralph said that wasn't a problem. He also looked forward to finally working as a proper party after so long. Hesta nodded in agreement and Chris felt the same. Chris wanted to fight strong opponents and gain combat experience as a team. Once he became stronger, he planned to travel the world. Following the locations in Otto the Botanist's travel journal, he hoped to collect poisonous plants with unknown effects. Eventually, he also wanted to find the skill fruit mentioned in the book. It was said to be hidden somewhere in the world because of its rarity and danger. Hesta was already feeling sleepy when she suddenly remembered something and called out to Ralph. She recalled that Ralph had some information to share with Chris. After a moment, Ralph finally remembered. He explained that at the Adventurers Guild, he had heard a rumor about someone who might be Chris's younger brother. Chris's expression darkened. Ralph had planned to tell him earlier, but he got so excited about saving money that he completely forgot. Chris asked what the rumor was about. Ralph hesitated, saying it wasn't a big deal and that there was no guarantee it was actually about Chris's younger brother. However, Chris, in a cold voice, told him to stop wasting time and just say it. Ralph felt a sudden chill and sat up from his bed. He then shared what he had overheard. Some adventurers were talking near the request board claiming that a hero candidate had enrolled in the Royal Capital's Academy. That was all. Chris took a moment to process the information. Ralph watched him with concern. Chris knew that alone wasn't enough to confirm whether it was Klaus or not. However, given the timing, there was a high chance it was him. He then asked the two to gather more information about Klaus in the Royal Capital. They both agreed to help. Chris reassured them that he wouldn't drag them into his plan to kill Klaus. But if he ended up forming a party, he might need them to deal with Klaus's party members. Ralph said that at first he didn't want to be involved in a real killing, but he didn't mind helping Chris. He realized that instead of living a normal life, it was much more exciting to be bold, even as a villain. Hesta admitted she felt the same way. If she had lived an ordinary life, she would never have gotten the chance to risk everything in a fight against a hero. She was also curious to see how much her magic had improved, and whether she could stand against the hero's party. She believed they only had one life to live and suggested making the most of it. Chris couldn't help but smile. He was truly glad to have formed a party with them. That is the end of the recap at Chapter 15. Please read the pinned comment about the next part.